But at the same time, we see nations getting left behind, nations that are struggling to industrialise. Of course, it becomes increasingly difficult to industrialise if your natural resources are being ripped out of the land and sent off to be processed in some other part of the world. Industrialisation and the rise of the factories was all happening in Britain in the late 18th and the early 19th century, and Britain's near European neighbours were very quickly aware that something was going on in Britain that was rather different to what was going on in their own countries, and they were very keen that their own nations would industrialise and grow rich in the way they perceived Britain to be doing at this time. It was very easy to move technology across Europe, and in fact we see the spread of industrialisation out of Britain into Europe really quite quickly. A lot of this occurs through industrial espionage and with manufacturers from different parts of Europe going to Britain, looking at how the factories were worked and how the machines were made, collaborating with somebody who was willing to try and export the machines. It was usually illegal to export the technology, but there are ways when you're minded to do so, and that's really very much what we see happening in Europe. The industrialisation moves firstly to the Francophone nations, to France, to Britain and Switzerland, where we start to see the really quick adoption of textile technology that's very similar to Britain's textile technology. And then very quickly we also start to see very different kinds of industrial revolutions emerging as well. So in the later 19th century we see lots of development of industrialisation in the German-speaking lands. There is some textile growth there as well, but there's a lot of heavy industry in the German lands, and a lot of coal mining, so we tend to see all of that developing in Germany in the later 19th century. But what's also interesting is we start to see really quite different industrial revolutions emerging. I always think then the Danish example is really interesting in that tends to be focused on the industrialisation of agricultural produce, the dairy industry, the meat industry. So we start to see industrial revolutions that look really nothing like the British Industrial Revolution at all. It spreads up obviously into the Nordic countries as well. Generally, Europe tends to be quite well disposed. It seems to be quite straightforward to get the technology to take place and to kind of take root in Europe. It seems to be quite easy to import the technologies and to make the changes, partly because these tend to be very sophisticated economies anyway. We see the growth of lots of new technologies. So coal worked really well in Britain. It transplants to Belgium and it transplants to Germany really easily as well, because they also have lots of coal. It doesn't travel to France or to Italy or to Switzerland because these places don't have coal, but we see the rise of electricity as a form, an alternative form of power generation. It's also quite interesting to see that there are parts of Europe where industrialisation really doesn't take root. So parts of Spain, we see very little industrialisation. Portugal remains almost entirely non-industrial right well into the 20th century. It remains an agricultural country with very little manufacturing at all. Many people living in homes without electricity or running water in the 20th century. So there are really clear limits to how and where industrialisation spreads in Europe. Parts of Central Europe as well, we see don't really transition to industrial status. So it's not enough to simply be close to Britain. You can be pretty close to Britain. You can also be a country that was historically very wealthy. So Portugal was a very wealthy nation. It was the owner of the seas in the 16th century and the 17th century. It has these amazing colonies out in the Americas, and yet it can't seem to capitalise on any of that and take off into industrialisation into the 20th century. And I think it's because culturally and economically and technologically it's actually just a very, very different kind of country altogether. Where we see industrialisation taking root, it takes place in Switzerland, France, Germany, Denmark, places that have already got quite sophisticated commercial manufacturing economies. They're manufacturing different things and they're making different things, but they're very interested in trying to make profit and trying to make improvements and innovations. And these are the places where industrialisation tends to jump to very naturally, very easily. At the same time as industrialisation is spreading to parts of continental Europe, we see a massive growth of industrial technologies in North America, Canada and the United States, and also over in Australia and New Zealand as well. I think there's something slightly different that's going on in these places that are industrialising. What we see in all of them is we have this commonality of lots of British people and very strong connections between these countries and Britain as well. And we can see technology transferring really very easily between these. We're looking at much bigger distances now than we're looking at in the case of continental Europe, but we're looking at very well established networks. So somebody might migrate to the United States, but their family might be in the coal mining regions in Wales, and so the news about new technologies travels very easily between the two countries, and you can see the new technologies taking place. What's also striking about all of these Anglophone examples is we've got British settlers in huge land masses with masses of local resources available, really abundant, relatively abundant local resources, very underpopulated parts of the world. They were populated, of course, before the British started to settle there, but they're very sparsely populated. So it's a very different kind of scenario to what we see in Europe, where we've got established and dense populations and existing manufacturers. What we seem to see in these parts of the world is the transplantation of British technology and techniques very easily and very seamlessly into these large land masses, which are really being pillaged for their local resources in very naked and very abusive ways. One of the really interesting things about what's happening with industrialisation in the 19th century is it's occurring in places that I think people just would not have assumed it was going to. If you go back to the 17th century, nobody would have thought that if there was going to be this new emergence of a very wealthy part of the world, nobody would have thought it would have been in Europe. And certainly nobody would have thought it would have been in Britain, because the centres of wealth are the Venetian city-states, the Italian city-states, and of course there's these kind of pockets of wealth with the trading nations of Portugal and Spain. Nobody would have thought it would have been Britain, Belgium, Switzerland. I mean, this is very unintuitive. Nobody would have thought it would have been Europe, because historically the centres, the kind of economic centres, had lain in the East, in China and in India. So there's something rather unintuitive about what's going on here. And in the 1990s and the early 2000s, there was a lot of interest amongst historians in trying to explain why it was that industrialisation had started in Britain and why it hadn't happened in somewhere like China, which was a more kind of natural and obvious place. And it was a really interesting question to put to historians, because of course we'd kind of lost sight of the fact there'd been so much focus on British industrialisation, we'd kind of lost sight of the fact that it was really very far from kind of the expected course of events. So some historians did start to argue that China had been on the cusp of an industrial revolution, and in fact it lost out in the race. And because Britain industrialised first, China was therefore held back by a really long time. This triggered a lot of research into the case of China. And I think most historians, the outcome of that very lively debate has been that China was actually a very different kind of economy in the 18th century. It was, and the same can be said of India as well, it was a very large economy, but the reason these economies tended to be very large, or were very large, was because they had a very large population. So before the rise of industrial revolution, a large population, all things being equal, you'll have more people making more things, making a bit more profit, and of course you've got fodder for your armies. You'll be a richer nation if you've got a bigger population. So France actually was the wealthiest nation in Europe, but it had a much bigger population than other parts of Europe, and that's really why it was had the biggest economy. So the size of the economy was owing to the fact that it had lots of people, not owing to the fact that they were doing things in interesting and innovative ways and in modern ways and in different ways. So a lot of those arguments about China, I think now we think they're probably a little bit overstated. China was a very rich country, but it was also a very traditional country economically. Manufacture tended to be very simple. It tended to be on peasant lines. You still had an awful lot of subsistence agriculture. A lot of households are doing their manufacturing for themselves rather than doing it for the market. And when you look at China in the round, yes, there's a lot of people, and yes, there's a lot about it that's very sophisticated and truly amazing. But actually, when you look at the manufacture, you see a much more traditional manufacturing sector. You don't really see something that's on the cusp, on the turning point of an industrial revolution. India is another really interesting case. There's a lot of textile manufacture, and of course India is a home of cotton textile manufacture. What we see during the 19th century is they start exporting more and more of their raw cotton all the way over to Britain. Britain turns it into cloth, and then it's re-exported all the way back to India, so that Indians are increasingly wearing cotton goods that have been made by Britain rather than by its own indigenous cotton industry. So it really loses out in the race to industrialisation, and it holds back Indian development for many, many years. So Asia is obviously the home of these large, thriving economies, but not particularly developed and sophisticated economies. There is one part of Asia that does start to industrialise before the outbreak of First World War, however, and that's Japan. And again, it's quite surprising. Japan had not historically been a more significant trading nation than its nearby neighbour of China, for example. But it's in Japan that we start to see industrialisation. And again, as in Britain, a lot of that industrialisation is around textiles. You can actually grow cotton in Japan, so they can grow and produce their own cotton textiles. But again, as we see in other forms of industrialisation, it's not just the textile industry that enables Japan to industrialise. They also start to industrialise things like the making of wine, their sake, for example. Industrialisation never remains confined to one sector of the economy. You start using those techniques wherever you're doing manufacturing, and we see exactly that happening in Japan as well. In reality, it was quite a sophisticated manufacturing economy by the late 19th century, and that's why it can absorb different ways of working quite deftly and quite swiftly, just as we see it doing before the outbreak of the war in 1914. When we start to look at industrialisation through a global frame, some of the things that we think are so interesting and so important when we look at British experiences start to appear quite differently. So clearly, for example, living standards do change and experiences change, and you've got the rise of the factories in different parts of the world. Stepping back and looking at the phenomenon as a whole, some other themes start to emerge really significantly. For me, one of the ones that really stands out is our relationship to the environment and our use of natural resources. You can have industrial revolutions without a revolution in the textile industry, but you cannot have an industrial revolution unless you start manufacturing lots more things. And if you're going to manufacture lots more things, you're going to need lots more raw material in order to do that process of transformation. So what we see wherever we see industrialisation is degradation to the environment. Sometimes that degradation to the environment is very local, so particularly where economies are chopping down trees and maybe they've got a wood industry, or where they are mining heavy metals and they've got mining industries and smelting industries. You'll see lots of pollution in the rivers and in the environment through those activities. But equally, if you're bringing in resources from another part of the world, that environmental degradation will be happening in some other part of the globe. So it doesn't necessarily have to happen on your shores. So Switzerland, for example, doesn't particularly degrade its own environment because it's bringing in raw materials from other parts of the world, and the damage is being done elsewhere. Globally, what we can see very clearly is that industrialisation changes our relationship to the natural world around us, both locally and globally, and has, without any shadow of doubt, has created enormous strains on the planet and on the natural environment. So the rise of global warming, for example, is one really clear example of that. It's all connected. And again, it's why I think the Industrial Revolution deserves its place as a real turning point, for good or for bad, but it definitely deserves its place as a turning point in human history. We simply just change our relationship to our planet and to the world and to resources, and we can just see this on a global scale where we start to do things like track temperatures over hundreds of years. One other way in which we can see a really big significant change when we look at the global perspective is this kind of sense of inequality and of complexity. So when I was thinking about living standards in Britain, I was suggesting that we move from a society where you have a few rich people and a large lot of not very wealthy people, all with a fairly similar experience. There's much more complicated social structure and economic kind of complex spread of wealth across society. When we look at global industrialisation, we see that even more acutely, and we see it across nations as well. So we see some nations doing really well through the process of industrialisation and growing richer and richer and richer. But at the same time, we see nations getting left behind, nations that are struggling to industrialise. Of course, it becomes increasingly difficult to industrialise if your natural resources are being ripped out of the land and sent off to be processed in some other part of the world. So it becomes ever more difficult to get a foothold into this process of industrialisation. And we see this great opening up of inequality as something that happens not just in the industrial nations themselves, but as something that happens between the industrial nations and between non-industrialising nations as well. Overall, we just see opening complexities and inequalities as one of the outcomes of the industrialisation process. When we think about the lives that we live in the modern world, it seems absolutely undeniable that they are shaped in the most profound ways by the process of industrialisation that kicked off in Britain in the late 18th century and then very rapidly spread beyond to other parts of the world as well. Our geopolitics, our culture, our diets, our clothes, our leisure, the environment that we live in, all of these things have been changed in the most fundamental of ways owing to the process of industrial revolution.